Top of the morning, fellow game devers. So basically, here's the deal. If you're one of these 23,000 people, you probably know me as someone who likes Deltarune and Undertale and makes video essays about them. And I still am. Don't do anything drastic now, those are coming right back. But today I have to let you in on a bit of a secret. As much as I love heart-rending JRPGs from Massachusetts, it may shock you to learn that my taste in gaming actually goes pretty far beyond that. I'm also, for example, a big fan of games that go a bit more like this. Games where, let's just say, you can't talk to the monsters. Or rather, you can talk to the monsters, but the only language they respond to is bullets, mostly with grunts of pain and more bullets. I am in fact such a big fan of these roguelike shooty type games that I've been making one, on and off, for the last year and a bit. That game is called RAM, and today, I'd like you to finally meet it. Like any good debut project, RAM derives much of its quality from how effectively it rips off other games that are better than it. However, despite the indisputable solidity of this design philosophy, I'm not the only developer on the team, and so I was convinced against my better judgment by a strange man named Toby that RAM would benefit from the inclusion of such things as original thought and innovation. Conveniently, Toby came to the table with just such an innovation in mind, and if I can say so myself, it was pretty fucking cool. Instead of just blurting out what this unique gimmick is, I'll attempt to give you a whirlwind tour of the thought process that led to it. Here's Nuclear Throne. It's a roguelike shooter where you play as one of several wacky characters with unique abilities and shoot at enemies until they die. Here's Hades, a roguelike beat-em-up where you wield one of several wacky weapons with unique abilities to strike and also shoot at enemies until they die. Here's The Binding of Isaac. It's a roguelike shooter where you play as one of several wacky characters with unique abilities and cry on enemies until they die. Here's Risk of Rain 2, a roguelike shooter where you play as one of several 3D characters with unique abilities and shoot at 3D enemies until they die. The common factor is clear. I wish I'd made one of these games instead of RAM. The other common factor is that the main source of playstyle variety between runs is the choice of some initial character or loadout that modifies the game's mechanics. Sometimes these changes are subtle, and other times it can act as an effective game within a game. And overall, the system is quite effective at increasing a game's replayability and letting the player bias runs toward a playstyle that they vibe with. This is probably why it's been used by every popular roguelike for the last 400 years. But what if, Toby asked, what if you didn't have to choose? What if this variety of playstyles was not accessed through a menu between runs, but instead baked into the core of the game loop itself? Well, that sounds pretty cool, Toby. But how? Controlling multiple characters at once in a game like this would be ridiculous, and switching perspectives between a mob of AI-controlled allies sounds less like a fun gimmick and more like something StarCraft pros would be forced to playtest in hell. But what if, we asked again, you could pass control between characters whose well-being you weren't liable for after releasing your grip on their minds? What if it was, in fact, desirable for these characters to meet gruesome fates the instant you revoked your protagonist's status? What if you just controlled the enemies? And there you have it, that's RAM. No player character to speak of beyond the idea of some intangible computer virus. Just you using enemies to kill other enemies and then themselves once they've stopped being you. Random access mayhem. Next question then. In a game where a standard and viable strategy for winning a gunfight is to get shot in the head and then become the guy who killed you, how do you actually lose? Well, enter the swap bar. This 536 pixel slab of crystallized mechanical contrivance is the beating heart of RAM's combat. This red meter fills up over time. If it reaches the end, you lose. To stop this from happening, you simply swap control to a new enemy and the timer resets. However, if this red part is below the yellow part, you're not allowed to swap, and any projectile-related malfunction of your host body results in true death. Furthermore, every time you swap, the yellow bar rises. How do you lower it?
Perpetrate ultraviolence.
This forms a very simple loop. To stay alive, you must swap. To swap, you must kill. And to kill, well, you need only be alive. And then of course we retroactively prop all of that up with lore. We will not be discussing that at this time. A subtle truth about designing a game where you exclusively control enemies is that the game will only be as fun as the enemies are to control. Look at this asshole. It walks to the left. Does this concept stimulate you? Are you tantalized by the moment-to-moment experience of this creature's existence? If so, there's this really cool game called Vampire Survivor. No, fuck the Goomba. I want to be this guy. I want to impose my will on a digital world with a powerful and expressive moveset. What I just said may seem obvious, but RAM, like many games, started its life as a submission to a game jam, and in the 3 days we had to work on it, the enemies we designed were a lot closer to the Goomba than Gabriel ULTRAKILL. And unfortunately, many of them still are. With the basic premise of the game out of the way, the main meat on the bones of this devlog will be our attempt to rectify this, or at least to start. Of the 8 playable enemy types that we've currently implemented, we've taken the jankiest 3 and overhauled them completely to meet our current non-game jam standard of quality. I'm sure you'll eventually get to meet the other ones too when we inevitably give them their glow-ups, but for now I present the first star of our show, the Chainbot. Okay, first of all, quick disclaimer. The names aren't finalized yet. Nothing actually is finalized, especially not the art. There is in fact no real artist on the team, so most of the character and tile sprite work you'll be seeing during gameplay is kitbashed from asset packs. This is what we in the business like to call a big fucking problem, so if anyone watching this has experience with spriting or 2D animation and is interested in working with us on RAM, please check the description for how to get in touch. Anyway, this is the Chainbot as it existed from the original Jam build until disturbingly recently. It is so called because it swings a chain. The basic concept of the enemy is a fast-moving melee class that can charge up its attacks for high damage, but has to slow to a crawl to do so. It can also only attack to the left or right, despite this being a top-down game because the asset pack we used only had sprites for attacking left or right. Suffice to say, not an ideal design methodology. To spice things up just a bit, we made it shoot a spread of weak projectiles when it attacks, but these ended up being largely irrelevant. The Chainbot was never an ineffective class. Its mobility and high burst damage actually made it pretty dominant after getting a few upgrades, but its use was, at all times, 100% brain dead. Run to enemy, hold down attack button, release, enemy dies. And that's not to say that single brain cell melee combat can't be unreasonably engaging if done well, but the Chainbot's bidirectional aim and charge-up period made it too clunky to excel even in that role. Simply put, it played like a saltine cracker. It needed an identity. So, we decided to make the Chainbot live up to its name. Enter the grapple. An actual chain, not the stubby little might-as-well-have-been-a-sword weapon from the sprite work. The function of the grapple was simple. Stick it to an enemy and pull them in. Hit an enemy while pulling them in though, and... well, in short, you reinvent paddleball. Except instead of having to trick you into thinking it's cool with increasingly contrived trick shots, our version of paddleball is inherently cool because it has screen shake and hit stop. At first, a little bit too much hit stop. But even so, it quickly became apparent that this new grapple-centric Chainbot was something of a dopamine fountain. The act of repeatedly striking a bouncy object tapping into some antediluvian nodule of the human brain was responsible for a critical survival skill on the plain of Africa, like, I don't know, playing soccer or something. The grapple, though, was not yet complete. As fun and powerful as the first iteration was, it was still too mindless. We needed to keep that power, but gate it behind an actual skill floor, and the way we did that was to commit even harder to reinventing ball sports. What had originally been an afterthought to the grapple mechanic, being able to hit enemies into other enemies for collision damage, is now the axis around which the entire Chainbot orbits. Melee damage is nerfed, the power of charged attacks aggressively capped, and the goofy little projectiles have finally been cut completely. The name of the game now is juggling. Performing the grapple hit combo from before no longer does much damage directly, but it does build up a juggle combo with each hit. This counter doesn't do much by itself, until you hit the grappled enemy with a charged attack. This breaks the grapple's hold and launches the enemy like a missile. The more times you juggle the enemy, the faster that missile goes. This is where the current Chainbot's damage comes from. Being hit by a max combo grapple launch one-shots all but the largest enemies, and usually also the enemy getting launched. For good measure, launch an enemy that explodes when it dies. Launch an enemy into another enemy's anime finisher move. The grapple launch's inherent physicsiness creates a surprising number of these emergent behaviors that I wasn't even thinking about when I programmed it, and that's a welcome change of pace to say the least. Next guy, the Wheelbot. Wheelbot is a speedy little goblin. Wheelbot's mobility is above average. Wheelbot locomotes at a pace that may be considered aspirational. The rate at which Wheelbot traverses 2D space is highly PogChamp. Wheelbot says, "Gotta go fast." Except it fucking doesn't. We put a character whose power is being fast into a game where going fast accomplishes nothing. Sounds familiar. There was only ever one solution: full character redesign. The Wheelbot's original means of attack was a little burst fire rifle. It was given this weapon not out of any grand vision, but because the game jam was almost over and we were out of better ideas. One rather unfortunate justification for giving the Wheelbot a burst weapon was to make it slightly easier to actually hit anything, since due to the brilliant design choice to have the bot's bullets inherit part of its momentum, this was by default not possible. Beneath this contextually terrible idea though was the glimmer of a good mindset: make the speed matter. Inject the feeling of velocity and momentum into the core of the Wheelbot's playstyle. And so for the redesign, we decided to replace the pea shooter with the power of throwing bricks. Or grenades technically, but with the vibe of bricks. Big hefty ones that you need to put your weight behind. With this change in framing, the bullets inheriting your momentum suddenly made sense, both in terms of feel and for the character's intended playstyle, because the impact damage of grenades scales with their speed. And to throw a grenade fast, you must first, yourself, become fast. It's still pretty fucking hard to aim though, but that's not so bad anymore because the Wheelbot is no longer a scout, it's a sniper. A weird sniper, sure, but if you break it down, it checks all the boxes. A class with high commitment attacks that take skill to aim, but when landed can shift a lot of damage across a long distance. The fact that the grenades still explode after a delay adds a bit of leeway back into the system and opens up room for trick shots, which are actually a big part of the game but too much to explain right now. Just picture something like throwing a grenade into an enemy's face, swapping to a new host just before it explodes, and then when it goes off you get bonus currency for killing the enemy with a host you weren't currently controlling. Finally, the Wheelbot's special ability was originally a sort of dash that effectively worked as a short-range teleport. The movement was instantaneous and precise, but didn't maintain much speed because, if you remember, speed wasn't actually valuable, whereas an iframe dash very much was. Now that speed actually matters for the Wheelbot though, we tweaked the dash into something more kinetic, more, well, Mario Kart. It now requires a brief charge-up that puts you into a drift, and upon releasing the button gives you instant velocity in a new direction. You still get iframes, but the main use is now to combo into whipping the most vicious heater of your life halfway across the map into an unsuspecting flamebot's exhaust port. Speaking of which, this guy sucked. The chainbot was boring, but at least it was strong. The wheelbot was anemic, but at least you could zoom it around and take a breather. The flamebot, though, was a chainbot on Xanax. Bidirectional aim, short-ranged, slow-moving, slow to attack, basically stationary while attacking, and even slow to stop attacking once you inevitably realized that continuing to do so was a death sentence. Its one saving grace was the highest per-second damage output in the game, a grace of limited value in the face of how laborious it was to actually get that damage onto an enemy health bar. Its special attack was, suicide. Admittedly fun when it worked, but hard to hit anything with since the bot froze in place for a second before exploding to give you a chance to swap away. All that is to say, the base flamebot was barely usable. Thing was, the flamebot with upgrades could actually be a good bit of fun. I haven't talked about upgrades at all yet, but if you've played a roguelike in the last 10 years, they're exactly what you think. The items in Isaac, the mutations in Nuclear Throne, the boons in Hades, etc. The only difference is, in RAM, each upgrade only applies to a specific type of enemy. Anyway, we had this one upgrade for the flamebot that gave it a much longer range, but made it slide backwards while firing as though its flamethrower was a rocket engine. This recoil thrust was intended as a drawback, but, quelle surprise, strapping a rocket to the bot that can barely fucking move turned out to be a bit of a game changer. Literally. Because we changed the game and gave flamebot rocket thrust by default, only better and omnidirectional. Because, obviously, it should have been omnidirectional. Originally, the flamebot's flame output decreased the longer you sustained fire. This was stupid because it front-loaded the damage and brought the bot even closer to an objectively nerfed chainbot. We not only removed this mechanic, we inverted it. Now the flamethrower gets stronger over time, and so does its recoil. This means you can open fire over here, use that fire to rocket boost over here, and by the time you arrive, build up enough flame pressure to demolish anything in the vicinity. You can also start melting an enemy, and by the time an incoming attack forces you to disengage, have enough thrust built up to quickly dart away without deactivating the flamethrower. It's still a bit janky to control compared to normal walking, but hey, We in the business call that mechanical depth. To balance the otherwise infinitely strengthening flamethrower, we added a new mechanic, overheat. Whenever you're firing, you heat up. Whenever you're not, you cool down. Get too hot and... This is often a detriment, but not always. Next up was a proper special attack. Since the Flamebot's weakest matchup is against fast and evasive foes like the Wheelbot, we gave it the ability to leave a sticky trail of tar on the ground behind it that slows enemies' movements and makes them easy targets. It's also highly flammable, which is good if you enjoy barbecues, but also means that each tar pool is one-time use. And whatever you do, definitely don't try opening the tar spigot while running the flamethrower. That would be extremely dangerous, and perhaps even...
suicide.
That's right, we kept the kamikaze mechanic. It's even better now since you can move around right up until the explosion. Well, you can count right, that's 3 characters. That means the devlog's over. It might be nice to see how all these changes come together in practice though, so I've conveniently combined my Patreon credits with several minutes of demonstrational combat to minimize the video's length. I'll just kind of talk over it, I guess. Still on script though, because I respect your time. First off, what was the main takeaway from this whole experience? I realized this was a high-level laying the groundwork kind of devlog that didn't get into much technical stuff, and hopefully you'll forgive me for that when I say that the alternative was talking about tile map layering systems for half an hour. But I still think there's some insight to be gleaned here about the decision-making process you face when trying to design character movesets from the ground up. Back when Toby and I were pumping out these characters for the game jam, the natural approach was very much to ask, what can the character do? We'd look at the art assets at our disposal and think about what their general theme would be. From the theme, we would then hash out a handful of abilities and do our best to translate those mental images into game mechanics. This approach is evident even in Ram's basic nomenclature. Wheelbot moves with wheel, Flamebot attacks with fire, etc. This kind of thought process is perfectly reasonable for churning out basic concepts, and maybe in a less interactive medium it would be sufficient by itself. But the problem I've become more and more attuned to while working for the last several months is that, with game design, asking what can the character do and only that question effectively results in designing your characters backward. Characters in action games are not just sprites and theming. That's part of them, sure, but more importantly for a game like Ram, playable characters are how they're used. The patterns of inputs and moment-to-moment tactics that their design funnels the player toward performing. If you only define mechanics at an aesthetic and conceptual level, this interactive aspect, the experience of using the character, will be more or less randomly generated for you in the process of translating your ideas into code. Putting the focus onto the character's function, we can revisit our naming scheme. The chainbot would instead be called the move toward enemy while holding attack button and release after about 1 second bot. The wheelbot would be the run in circles around enemies while spraying as many bullets as possible bot, and the flamebot would be the approach a slow-moving enemy the instant after it attacks, then hold attack button and pray that it dies before it can shoot again bot. These playstyles, well, suck, and that's because none of them were explicitly designed by us at all. They were just what plopped out when we cast our conceptual character designs into an interactive format. All that is to say, to get any of Ram's characters to their current states, we've had to move away from asking what can the character do, and instead directly address the question of how do you use the character. This is a very different type of creative process, and one that, for me, taps more into your sense of kinesthesis than visual imagination. The new chainbot isn't based on how chain weapons would actually be used, but instead on the rhythm and precision of smacking a paddleball. The wheelbot is less about speed for the sake of locomotion and more about the satisfying transfer of momentum into a thrown object from a running start, and making precise strafing passes at enemies while weaving through their own attacks. And the fact that the flamebot attacks with a flamethrower is now secondary to the interplay between moving with and against its recoil thrust and pushing for the longest flame burst possible without ever quite tipping over the edge and blowing up. Unless you wanted to, of course. These gimmicks aren't aesthetic or conceptual, they're actions, processes that you do, constantly, and that make you feel some kind of way. And that's good, basically. If anyone hasn't gotten bored and left yet, thank you for watching my glorified advertisement, devlog. For anyone whose names are in the ongoing credits, I realize this likely isn't the kind of video you pictured seeing when you chose to donate, and for that I apologize. These digressions into game dev land won't be a frequent occurrence, and the next few videos I have planned are in the traditional video essay format. Toby and I will also be releasing a playable demo of Ram's combat to my Patreon donors as thanks for bearing with me this whole time. If you're interested in following RAM's further development, consider wishlisting it on the Steam page we just got up, link in the description, or joining my Discord server where we have a dedicated channel for discussing the game. You'll have to walk past a bunch of Deltarune weirdos on the way in though, so sorry about that. The next steps for RAM's development are getting the rest of the characters up to the same standard as the aforementioned 3 and implementing a larger scale structure for the game. Things like level generation, room design, and a global difficulty curve. It's supposed to be a roguelike after all, not just an endless Thunderdome, but those systems and the one boss we've made are too early in development to show off yet. Happy game deving to all who made it this far, and I'll see you next time with some Deltarune shit.